Okay, everybody, this is the third and final part of my digestive system presentation. In the first video, it was kind of an introduction with what the alimentary canal was, accessory organs, and we started talking about the parts of the mouth. In the second video, we went on talking about the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the stomach. And we talked about the cardiac sphincter and the pyloric sphincter and what these roles of these sphincters are. In this video, we're going to look at the pancreas, small intestine, large intestine, liver, and gallbladder. Now, like I said in the second video that we have on this, there is a lot of acid in our stomach, and we use that acid in order to help chemically digest our food. And there's a little door at the end of our stomach called the pyloric sphincter that slowly opens up so this soupy mixture with acidic mixture called chyme can leave the stomach and go into the small intestine. But our small intestine does not have this protective mucus lining over it. So we have to make sure that that acid gets neutralized before it starts passing through our small intestines. And that's going to be one of the jobs of the pancreas. Now, the pancreas actually looks like your hand. It kind of folds over your stomach and your small intestines. And it actually has two different jobs. One deals with your digestive system, and one is part of just homeostasis and your cardiovascular system. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about both of them here. Now, if you could actually look at a slide of your pancreas underneath the microscope, you would have some cells, you would have some cells that are really, really, really little. And they're kind of in clusters. And then you have some big cells in between them. Well, remember, structure determines function. So if you have two different kinds of cells, that lets you know that there's two different types of jobs that will be going on. And in the case of the pancreas, some of the cells, those really little cells that are bundled together, are called the islets of Langerhans, named after Dr. Langerhans, who figured out what they do. And he began to study these cells, and he noticed that some of these cells secreted one type of chemical, and the other cells secreted a different type of chemical. And he has what he called alpha cells, because he figured those out first, and then he has beta cells. Well, your pancreas, one of the jobs of your pancreas is to turn your liver on and off. And so the liver is also an accessory organ that deals with your cardiovascular system, it deals with your excretory system, it deals with your digestive system. The liver is actually talked about with the digestive system because this is the function that was discovered first. But your liver is the largest organ you have in your body. Your largest organ is your skin. So if it's pretty big, you know it's going to have lots of different jobs. It's got lots of different types of cells in it. But in the case of your cardiovascular system, you can think of your liver as a faucet that needs to be turned on and off. Because one of the jobs of your liver is to feed your blood. We talked about this way back when we did negative feedback. Well, your pancreas, your alpha cells, make something called glucagon. Glu means sugar, and gon means to release. So glucagon tells the liver to release sugar. Glucose be gone. So that's like turning the faucet on, and sugar dumps into your bloodstream. So that's going to raise your blood sugar. Well, if you add too much sugar to your blood, you can cause your blood to become thicker, you can cause your red blood cells to become dehydrated. So it's a very delicate balance. And once your body realizes there's enough sugar in your blood, the pancreas will then tell the liver to turn off by secreting what's called insulin. So it's going to tell the liver to keep the sugar in. So it's like you turning the faucet off and keeping the water in the pipes. Well, people with diabetes have some type of problem with their pancreas. You have two types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is commonly called juvenile diabetes, not because only kids can get it, but it tends to show up and get discovered when people are children. Juvenile diabetes is an example of what's called an autoimmune disorder. Remember, all of our cells have marker proteins. That's how our cells know that it's your cell. Well, for some reason, people with autoimmune disorders, their white blood cells disregard that. And your white blood cells destroy your cells that are supposed to be there. Well, people with type 1 diabetes, their own immune system destroys destroys beta cells. So they cannot turn the faucet off. So they can't make insulin. So the liver is constantly secreting sugar into the bloodstream. It's like leaving a faucet just running. And so this is why people have to take insulin in order to get that to turn off. Now there's also what's called type 2 diabetes, which we see in pregnant ladies, and sometimes people are overweight. Type 2 diabetes, your pancreas is fine. Your pancreas makes glucagon, your pancreas makes insulin, but there's something wrong with the liver. And there's lots of different things we can call type 2 diabetes. But with type 2 diabetes, you're making insulin, you're making glucagon, but for some reason your body doesn't recognize that. Now, in the regards to what we're talking about with the pancreas, the big cells in the pancreas play a role in the digestive system. And those big cells secrete what's called sodium bicarbonate. And sodium bicarbonate is a base. It's what's found in Tums, Rolaids, Pepto-Bismol. It's like a chalk. And so what happens, if you can look at this picture here, right here you'll see two small openings. And those small openings are basically like faucets. They're like, I use faucets a lot, that can be turned on and off. So when the small intestine, when the pyloric sphincter is closed, nothing is going to the small intestine, those little holes are squeezed shut. But when the pyloric sphincter starts to open up, that part of the small intestine starts to open up, and those two holes open up. And like this white chalky stuff comes rushing out. And that white chalky stuff is called sodium bicarbonate, and it's a base. So as this acid leaves the stomach, it will mix with the sodium bicarbonate. And you know that when you mix acids and bases together, you make salt and water. So it's going to help neutralize that acid before it can move down into the rest of the small intestine. So speaking of the small intestine gets its name because it's narrow. Okay? It's named according to its diameter, not its length. And just to give you guys an idea, the average human small intestine is 20 feet long. You have 20 feet of small intestine shoved into this one little space, where you also find your kidneys, you also find your large intestine, you have your liver, you have, ladies, you have your uterus, you have your bladder. All that is right there. Because remember, folds equal surface area. The more folds we have, the more we can absorb. Okay, the more stuff we can slurp up. And in the case of our small intestine, it really is the main organ. This is where we get our nutrients. This is where absorption is going to take place. It is held in place by what's called the mesentery, and that's what you're seeing here in this picture. It's this membrane that we use to keep our intestines kind of coiled up and nice and strong. And if you ever get to do a pig dissection or a cat dissection in your anatomy class, you'll be able to tear that mesentery and unravel your small intestines. It is highly folded, and if you could cut open the small intestine, you would see millions of little folds inside of them. And those little folds are villi. Now remember, in the stomach, those folds are called ruga. Anytime you see ruga, that's there to let the organ expand. You do not want your intestines to expand. You do not want the villi, because remember when your thing expands, the folds straighten out. Villi are not there to expand. That's why they're not called ruga. Think of villi as little sponges that help soak up the nutrients. And in the case of our large intestine, our small intestine is actually divided into 3 different parts. So in the case of our small intestine, the first part is called the duodenum. Some people say duodenum. Tomato, tomato. Okay. These are about the first 10 inches of your small intestine, and this is where it attaches to the stomach. This is the only part of your small intestine that has mucus, because this is where the pyloric sphincter opens up and that soupy acidic mixture enters your small intestine. So this is also where the pancreas attaches. It's called the pancreatic duct. It attaches in order to dump out that sodium bicarbonate. The next about 8 feet is called the jejunum. And this is where most of the absorption takes place. So this is where we're absorbing all of our nutrients. And then the last part is called the ileum. It's about the last 12 feet. And honestly, about 90% of all absorption takes place in the jejunum. And so by the time you reach the ileum, you're probably not going to be absorbed. But remember, better safe than sorry. We've got 12 feet just to make sure this is stuff that we're going to absorb. And then the small attaches to the large intestine. And it actually attaches, about right here. Okay. And that is where we find your appendix. So we're going to go ahead and talk about your appendix for a second. Your appendix is about the size of your pinky. It is an example of what's called a vestigial organ. It has no purpose in humans anymore. It was believed at one time to secrete an enzyme to help us break down cellulose. And cellulose is what we know of as fiber. And as you can see, the large intestines have all these folds in them. And the folds of the large intestines are called haustra. And they're there to absorb water. That's one of the jobs of the large intestine. Well, food particles, cellulose, fiber, we don't have an appendix that works anymore. And so that food particles, we can't break down cellulose, so plant products can get stuck in those folds and they can rot and cause a lot of intestinal problems. But cellulose, fiber, metamucil, all that stuff, we've all eaten celery and we all know those stringy things. Think of that as cellulose. Since our appendix doesn't work, we can now use that cellulose as a broom to sweep out all these folds in our intestines in order to make sure that food doesn't get stuck there. Now, when people have appendicitis, for most of us, the little opening is closed, but sometimes when people get appendicitis, the little opening that leads into that little gland, bacteria or things might get down in there. And bacteria give off toxic gases and toxic chemicals. They give off waste products just like we do. And that can cause the appendix to swell. And that's what appendicitis is. And if the appendix swells so much it pops, it releases all that toxicity into the body. And there's no sponge to help me soak it back up. So that's why it can be fatal. But in the case of your large intestine, it's also called your colon. It also has different parts, as you can see here. Where your large intestine attaches to your small intestine, a lot of times it's called the cecum, and there's another doorway there. So where I have this green would be another doorway. This is a sphincter muscle. So the cardiac sphincter is where the esophagus attaches to the stomach. The pyloric sphincter is where the stomach attaches to the small intestine, and then the ileocolic valve is where the small intestine attaches to the large intestine. And ileo is referring to the ileum, which is the end of the small intestine. And colic is referring to the colon, which is another name for your large intestine. And as you can see here, remember these are drawn as if you're looking down at yourself. So right here, we have the ascending colon. So that's the part that goes up. The transverse colon comes across. The descending colon obviously comes down. And then we have what's called the sigmoid colon. The sigmoid colon kind of has like these curves in it in order to increase surface area. And then the end of our large intestine is called the rectum. And then the opening to our large intestine is, as you know, the anal opening. So the large intestine is also called the colon. And it is about 5 to 6 feet long. And its main job is to absorb water back into the bloodstream. Now, because as water passes through our stomach, as food passes through our stomach and our small intestine, it has to be a liquid so it can move. But we can't constantly be losing water. So our large intestine will reabsorb that water, and that's why our fecal material comes out hard like a ball. And the rectum, by the time it reaches the rectum, absorption is done. The rectum is just kind of a holding chamber. And then we have another sphincter muscle right here. Okay, it's called the anal sphincter. And what's interesting about the anal sphincter, it's one of the very few sphincter muscles we have in our body that's voluntary. It's made from skeletal muscle. You had to be potty trained. You had to learn when to open and close that muscle. And so this is why, something you'll probably always want to know about, diarrhea and constipation. When people are constipated, their body realizes they're dehydrated, and they tell their large intestine to suck out as much water as possible, so it can cause the fecal material to back up. And on the opposite end, when you have diarrhea, your body realizes there's a chemical that shouldn't be there, and it needs to wash out your digestive system. If it catches it fast enough, you can vomit in order to get that out. But if it's already left the stomach, your body will tell your large intestine, stop absorbing water, because you don't want to absorb that chemical. We need to wash out the intestines, and that's what diarrhea is. And on here it says also responsible for eliminating solid waste. So in the case of your alimentary canal, you have mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, anal opening. Accessory organs, salivary glands, teeth, tongue, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. Your liver is the largest organ you have inside of your body, and it has lots of different jobs. But in the case of your digestive system, its job is to make something called bile. And bile is a chemical that our small intestines need in order to absorb fat. Your liver also stores glycogen, which is what we call animal sugar. This is the sugar that we use to feed blood. However, your liver itself has a lot of fat in it. So your liver has all these little drainage tubes in them. And these drainage tubes are called hepatic ducts. Those are all these things that you see in here. These are all what we call hepatic ducts. And anytime you see HEPA, HEPA means liver. So it's like having all these like you have all these different sinks in your house, and you have all these pipes coming off of each sink, or coming off the shower, coming off the toilet. Well, that would be like your hepatic ducts. And then all the drain tubes in your house eventually lead to one big pipe that leaves your house and goes to the street. Well, your liver is the same way. All like the little drains in your sinks and showers and toilets would be hepatic ducts, and they would all fuse together to form what's called your cystic duct. And the root word cyst means ball, bladder, balloon. So anytime you see cyst, it's talking about the gallbladder, or it's talking about your urinary bladder. And so we have this thing called the cystic duct, which would be like all the wastewater from your house goes to one tube, and that one tube takes it to the street. Well, the cystic duct would be like that tube that takes you to the street. All the hepatic ducts dump into the cystic duct, and then the cystic duct takes the bile into the gallbladder. Your liver makes the bile, but your gallbladder will store it. So as you can see here, these would all be the little cystic ducts, and they all hepatic duct, they dump into this, which is called the cystic duct. And the cystic duct is kind of like a V, and that will take bile into the gallbladder where it's stored. And it's a small sac. If you could actually flip the liver over, it would look like you have like a deflated green or brown balloon. That's your gallbladder. And it holds the bile that the liver makes. Now, in the case of your bile duct, okay, I'm just going to draw. It looks like this. Okay. Here's your liver. Here's your gallbladder. This portion here is the cystic duct. This portion down here, as you can see in the drawing, is called the common bile duct. Now, you have another sphincter muscle right here that will open and close. When it's closed, that allows bile to go from the liver into the gallbladder so that it can be stored. When it's open, that allows bile to leave the gallbladder and go down to the small intestine. The common bile duct attaches to the small intestine. You can live without your gallbladder. By having a gallbladder, that allows the liver to take a break. The liver has lots of jobs, and one of the jobs of the liver is to make the bile. Well, it'll send the bile to the gallbladder, and once the gallbladder is full, it tells Mr. Liver, hey, you can take a break, you don't need to make bile anymore. And then when the gallbladder starts to empty out, it calls the liver and says, hey, I need you to make more bile. Well, people who don't have a gallbladder, the liver has to consistently make bile, whether it needs it or not. So it's kind of wasteful, because if you don't have a gallbladder, your bile has to go straight down into your small intestine. And so it's like having a leaky faucet. Your liver never gets to take a break. It constantly makes bile, whether you need it or not. And so the nice thing about having the gallbladder is if you have like a salad that doesn't have a lot of fat, you don't have to make a lot of bile. But if you have something like fried chicken that has a lot of fat, you need a lot of bile. Well, people who don't have a gallbladder, they can't regulate that. And so they have to be real careful with the fatty foods they eat. Because if you and I, who have gallbladders, eat fatty foods, our gallbladder goes, oh, you need a bunch of bile, let me give you a bunch of bile. If you don't have that gallbladder, you can't do that. You can have an infection of this. It's called cholecystitis. It can be a bacterial infection. Now, bile has solid particles in it. And so if bile is circulating, the gallbladder is smooth muscle. If it circulates, it's possible that those solid particles, it's just like when you have cookie dough in your hand. You know, if it circulates, you form a ball. Well, this is what gallstones are. You can form a ball, and if the stone is too big, it can cause the bile duct and these different tubes to get blocked, and that can cause the gallbladder to swell, and it can cause it to tear and get infected. And jaundice is very common in young children because remember, it takes, when children are first born, their brains have to figure out, okay, this is a whole new world. It's something totally new. And their brains have to figure out what's going on. So they tend to overmake bile. And that bile diffuses into the bloodstream. And so bile, when it gets into our skin tissues and different proteins in our body, it turns yellow. So it's very common for children to become jaundice. And so the doctors will just tell you to sit them in a window and let the sun shine on them because UV light helps break down that bile.